Hi, good morning, good evening to our dear friends across the globe. Welcome to the webinar today. I am Shruti Mehrotra. For almost 15 years so far, I have worked in pharmacovigilance industry and had the privilege to contribute and learn with some renowned names of the pharmaceutical world. However, coming to the webinar, the topic for today's webinar is Clinical Trial Facilitation Group, CTFG Guidance for Reference Safety Information. In the clinical safety and PV world, the sensitivity and importance of reference safety information segment of IB cannot be undermined. Needless to say, a comprehensive review of CTFG guideline is vital to conceptualize the preparation of reference safety information in the clinical development of any investigational medicinal product. RSI plays an important role during clinical trials. Therefore, authoring a compliant RSI and addressing all the safety concerns is critical. CTFG advises sponsors that the primary purpose of the RSI is to serve the basis for expectedness assessment of suspected serious adverse reactions for expedited reporting of SUSARs and annual safety reporting. With such an interesting and important topic, I would like to hear more about it from our speakers. But before, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping rules. You are welcome to post your questions during the webinar. We will do our level best to answer them. In case we are unable to answer your questions due to time constraint, we will try our level best to respond to you via email. Webinar will be available for download on demand after a couple of days. Our speakers today are Dr. Sanjeev Miglani and Dr. Arun Ram. Dr. Miglani is the founder and director of Avinsa Life Sciences. He is MD in internal medicine with over 20 years of experience in the field of medicine, pharmacovigilance, and clinical research. Previously, he was the vice president of safety and medical affairs at APSR. He had also been the vice president for pharmacovigilance and medical writing at Accenture and had been director of medical affairs at TenERX. He worked as senior resident in cardiology and medicine department in some of the prestigious hospitals of New Delhi and has authored numerous publications in medical journals and books to his credit. Dr. Arun Ram, he is the medical director of pharmacovigilance and medical affairs at Avinsa Life Sciences, based in Virginia, US. Dr. Ram oversees medical affairs and pharmacovigilance activities across different therapeutic areas, including oncology, respiratory, neurology, cardiology, gastroenterology, and psychiatry. He was pharmacovigilance leader for Novartis, project head for Pfizer drug safety surveillance, and senior research scientist for Ranbaxy. Currently, Dr. Ram also serves as professor of medical pharmacology at Eastern Virginia Medical School. So with this introduction, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Sanjeev to start with today's presentation. Dr. Sanjeev.
Thanks, Shruti, for such a nice introduction. So today in this webinar, we are going to talk about the following topics. I'll be talking about the purpose of reference safety information. Then I'll talk about the location and format of reference safety information. I'll also touch base on the different kind of parameters that have to be taken into account while doing expectedness assessment. And of course, severity and specificity are two most important topics that we have to take into account while doing the assessment of expectedness, and that's basically going to be applicable for incorporation into the RSI. And I'll also talk about the exact way of presentation of the safety information, how it has to be presented in the reference safety information, and my colleague Arun will talk about the procedure for update of reference safety information. He'll also talk about when the amendment is considered to be substantial or non-substantial, and he'll also talk about RSI versioning at the end. Okay, so I think the most important thing what we need to understand is what exactly is reference safety information. So a reference safety information is primarily a section within the investigator brochure, or for that matter, within the summary of product characteristics, if you're talking about a product which is also in the marketing phase. So the information which is expected is basically the reference safety information in investigator brochure or the summary of product characteristics. Now, the CTFG guidance document very clearly mentions that if we are talking about IB, and in fact, Shruti also mentioned in the beginning, the reference safety information for IB is practically a list of expected serious adverse reactions. And these serious adverse reactions have to be classified using preferred terms according to MEDRA. Of course, if you're talking about the summary of product characteristics, which is basically the scenario applicable for products which are in the post-marketing phase. So in that scenario, we can have RSI having both serious as well as non-serious events. But strictly speaking, if we are talking about IP for clinical trials, and if the investigation product is purely into the investigation phase, then the RSI or the reference safety information is to include only the list of serious expected adverse reactions based on which the assessment of expectedness is done. And the other point that we need to understand is that I mean, like, there could be a section for safety, which could be section 6, but then specifically the RSI has to be in a subsection, again in a particular format, which I'll be talking about in the subsequent slides. And using that particular tabular format, the list of the serious adverse reactions which are given in that, so that basically is the basis for making a decision whether the event is expected or unexpected, and then accordingly the decision of SUSAR is taken, and then those SUSARs are required to be reported to many of the regulatory authorities, like in the US or Europe, on an expedited basis. Of course, there are some countries where the submissions for all the essays are required, like in India, all essays, irrespective of the relationship, have to be reported. But generally, when we talk about SUSARs for the countries like US or like in European countries, so it's a SUSAR, and the assessment of that expectedness, which basically decides the SUSARs, have to be used or have to be done based on the RSA section. Okay. So what all purposes are there for the reference safety information? The CTFG guidance document clearly talks about the exact purpose of the reference safety information. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, the most important part is that this particular section of the RSI is meant for assessing the expectedness of all the serious adverse reactions that happened during the clinical trial. So this section should have a clear-cut list of the SARs in the format which CTFG guidance document mentions, and again I'll talk about that in my subsequent slide. And of course, if those SARs have to be incorporated in the RSI, the CTFG guidance document says that only those SARs should be captured that have occurred more than once. And if there are some SARs which have occurred not more than once, the only rationale that should be there for inclusion in the RSA should be that there should be a strong causal association, like say there could be a positive rechallenge, and there is a strong evidence to implicate the causality. So otherwise, only those SARs should be included which have happened more than once. So that's a very standard rule as per the CTFG guidance document. And of course, there are exceptions, like as I mentioned, if there is this case with a strong causal association. So I can take the example of, say, drug-induced liver injury, wherein classically, if we have a case where there is a typical elevation of SGOT and SGPT, and maybe we see a pattern which is consistent with drug-induced liver injury, where say bilirubin is slightly raised but not highly raised, but it is in line with the positive Hy's laws. So even if we have a single case at times, there can be exceptional scenarios wherein, say, we are able to rule out any other confounding factors. Maybe the pattern of typical drug-induced liver injury is there. We have a scenario in which a drug is withdrawn, the enzymes come down, and then the moment the drug is given again, say the liver enzymes again starts rising. So in those kind of typical scenarios where you have a classical reason to demonstrate that causal association, so in those kind of cases, even if there is a single SAR, they can be included in the RSA with a valid justification. But otherwise, the CTFG guidance document is very clear in that regard. The SARs which have happened only once should generally be not be taken in the RSI. And the other part is the fatal life-threatening events. And before I talk about the fatal life-threatening event, one more thing that CTFG guidance document mentions is that the decision of basically having those serious adverse reactions should be based on the data from the human population. So it should not be based on the anticipated pharmacological properties of the drugs or from the preclinical data. So the SARs that have to be captured should be strictly based on the human population, from the human clinical data that we are doing. And the other part is that, as a general rule, sponsors should not expect an investigational medicinal product to cause fatal serious adverse reactions. So life-threatening SARs should not be considered unexpected for investigational medicinal product unless supported by a positive benefit risk balance. Again, there can be exceptions to the rule. Of course, I'm not saying that you cannot have a fatal SAR or a life-threatening SAR in an IB, but then if the sponsor decides to keep that in the RSI section, obviously there has to be a valid rationale. Like you might have seen some of the IBs or SMPCs having terms like fatal myocarditis or fatal rhabdomyolysis. So obviously, if a decision is taken to include fatal event of say fatal pneumonitis, so obviously in those scenarios, the pattern would have been seen typically for a strong causal association, and of course, typically we would expect that there are more than such events before they are included. Otherwise, generally the regulatory authorities expect that if there is a fatal event, they should be considered expected and they should be reported to the regulatory authorities on an expedited basis. I mean, like classically for US and Europe, and that's why even if you look at the SIOM's guidance document, it clearly mentions that, say, if you have an event, say pneumonitis, if it is mentioned in your RSI, either in the SMPC or in your IB, but then if the patient dies because of because of pneumonia, which is fatal pneumonitis, then those events have to be considered unexpected unless a decision is taken to capture the term fatal pneumonitis or fatal myocarditis in the RSA section. Now, another important point that has to be taken into account is the location of RSIs for the investigational medicinal products. Now, for practical purposes, when we talk about the IB, so the RSI has to be a specific section within the IB, and this section has to be clearly called out, especially in the cover letter when we are submitting the IB. And say if the DSUR is being aligned along with the IB, so this RSI section should be clearly mentioned, and we should mention about the list of the expected SARs in the DSUR. Also, if we are aligning the two documents, DSUR and IB, one may say, what about the other safety information, which is basically not a serious expected reaction? Say, if we're talking about those kind of serious events which are not related, or if there are some known serious adverse reactions. So obviously, in the IB, they have to be included, but they can be included in the other safety sections, or it could be in the section on summary of data and the guidance for the investigator, or then there is a section on effect in humans. So all that data is, of course, relevant. But when we are talking about RSI, which is basically the section used for the purpose of expedited reporting, or maybe even for the DSUR when we are trying to prepare a cumulative summary tabulation and we have to take into account the expected or unexpected. So that has to be based on the serious adverse expected reactions. Otherwise, of course, the other data has to be captured in some of the other sections, but that will not decide the effectiveness of the event. Now, if it comes to the IMPs, which have also the marketing authorization at the same time. So as per the CTFG guidance document, the RSI of the IMP with the marketing authorization in EU can be the table or the list of adverse reactions in section 4.8, which is undesirable effects of the appropriate summary of product characteristics. So of course, in that scenario, there can be events which could be non-serious also. So because most of you would have seen that in the SMPCs, it's not like only serious adverse reactions are there. That is also containing the list of non-serious adverse reactions, but that's basically for the products in the marketing phase. But if there is a product which is purely into the clinical trial phase and the sponsor is obviously having the IB, so then the RSI has to be strictly be having only the serious adverse events which are related, I mean the serious adverse reactions practically. Now, if the investigational medicinal product has a marketing authorization in several member states with different SMPCs, the sponsor should justify its selection of the most appropriate SMPC with reference to the subject safety as the reference safety information. Of course, the differences to the most recent version of an existing EU SMPC should be justified, and a clearly separated specific section within the IB may also be used as a RSI for an IMP within the terms of its marketing authorization in the EU. Now, CTFG guidance document also talks about the format for the RSI in the IB, and this RSI pattern should be in the form of a table where the nature of the expected SARs must be listed by SOC and using the preferred terms, which should be followed by the frequency. And if the investigation medicinal product is under development in different medical conditions, so separate tables of expected SARs by indication may be appropriate if the expected SARs are different. So this is a very important point, because sometimes there are some products which are, especially in oncology, the product could be tried in different oncology indications, and in fact there are some products which could be even for some oncology indication, and they could be, say, in some respiratory indication. So in such scenarios, first of all, the sponsor has to see the risk benefit profile of the drug, and in case they think that okay, the risk profile might differ, generally it will not, but say in case there is a strong rationale to suggest that there is a difference in the risk profile based on the underlying indication. So if a list of a separate table in the form of an RSI is required to be made for different indication, so there can be more than one table also, and both the tables can have the list of expected SARs based on the indication. And of course, there would be some common element anyway in both the tables. The other important point also that is to be taken into account in the RSI table as per the CTFG guidance document is that the frequencies of the expected SARs listed in the reference safety information are preferred to be in categories in analogy to the recommendation for the summary of product characteristics, which is section 4.8, wherever possible. And if there is an insufficient number of subjects who are exposed to the IMP to use these categories, so the number of observed suspected SARs for each expected SAR should be provided together with the number of patients who are exposed. Now, I mentioned about the fatal and life-threatening suspected SARs in the RSI. So as a general rule, as I mentioned earlier, fatal life-threatening events should always be considered unexpected whenever we are getting those SAs. But yes, if there is a specific mention of the fatal life-threatening event in the SNPC or maybe the existing RSA section of IB, then yes, of course, then those events can be considered expected. But then whenever there is a decision to update the IB, and if we are including any fatal life-threatening reaction, there has to be a strong rationale. There has to be a strong rationale with strong causality, which could be like the events, say if a patient had myocarditis or rhabdomyolysis. So if we know that okay, there is a strong causal association, there are a lot of patients who are actually having that kind of event, and there is a rationale that okay, why the rhabdomyolysis were occurring, was there a kind of a reasonable temporal frame, and maybe some patients had elevation of the kidney function test, and then there was a kind of a improvement also, and then the patient eventually died after the drug was given again. So if there is a kind of a strong reason to believe that yes, that event was still due to the drug, then that is considered to be then that can be considered for inclusion in the IB or in the SNPC. So it is recommended to provide the information about the unexpected events either in a subsection on safety under effect in humans or in the section summary of data. So that is basically applicable when we are not considering those as expected, and we know that there are fatal life-threatening events. But if the decision is not taken to take them as expected, so again they can go in the other sections, because ultimately they're not expected. Because the moment we say it is expected, it has to go into the RSI section. Now, this is the typical example of the RSI table. This is exactly taken from the CTFG guidance document, the question and answer document that they have published. I think that was in 2017, around 6 to 7 years back. So you can see some of the events, diarrhea or ALT increase or AST increase. Now, the capital N is the number of subjects who are exposed, and then the small n is the number of subjects who had that particular adverse reaction. So this basically table is trying to implicate that yes, there were say 25 subjects who had diarrhea, and this is basically equivalent to 7.6%. So if we look into the frequency categorization, anything that falls into 1 to 10% is common. If some adverse reaction is more than 10% or equal to 10%, so that's equivalent to very common. So this is the same methodology that is also used in the summary of product characteristics, wherein when a decision is taken to make a event with a particular frequency categorization. So in the IB also the similar frequency categorization used. And like in this example again, you can see that there is a event of myocarditis. There are two events of myocarditis which are life-threatening, but maybe because there was a strong reason to believe that there was a strong causal association, so it was decided that yes, this event was captured as fatal life-threatening also. But otherwise, generally, the fatal life-threatening event should not be considered to be expected. Now, a very important topic that all of us would need to understand is the role of specificity and severity in the decision on the expectedness assessment. Even the CTFG, even the SIOMS guidance, I mean to say, talks very strongly about the assessment of the expectedness. And these are some examples, classical examples. Of course, in every case, there is a kind of a subjective decision that has to be taken by the medical reviewers. But we need to understand this concept of specificity and severity. Otherwise, if you look into the definition of an unexpected event, it seems to be a very simple statement that any adverse event, the nature, the severity, and specificity of which is not in line with the IB, or if it is not consistent with the information in the IB or the SMPC, so it becomes unexpected. Even though it's a very simple definition, but that definition carries a lot of meaning, and we have to interpret that based on the presentation of the case, based on the way the case narrative is described to us, or the way investigator provides the information. Like say, if we have a patient who presents to us with interstitial nephritis, which is a specific form of a renal parenchymal disease, but our RSI section just says that acute renal failure is expected. So obviously, based on the specificity, the adverse event has to be captured as unlisted in that particular scenario. Similarly, if our RSI just mentions hepatitis, but the patient with whom we are dealing with is having fulminant hepatitis, and which is a much severe form, so that event would become unlisted. Similarly, if a patient has a vasculitis stroke and the patient is having just, I mean, like our patient has specific form of cerebrovascular accident, and this RSI just mentioned cerebrovascular accident, then that would be unexpected. Now, if our RSI just says exfoliative dermatitis, but our patient has, say, erythema multiforme or Stevens-Johnson, which is much severe form of exfoliation. So based on the higher degree of severity and more specificity, so that event would become unexpected. Whenever there is any liver function abnormality, we have to see whether the RSI mentions anything about the duration, whether it's a transient duration, because sometimes there are some RSIs which would say that, okay, transient increase in LFTs was observed. So if a patient is having a persistent liver function test abnormality, so of course that would again be unlisted. Say in our patient, if somebody presented as hypertensive crisis, but the RSI section just mentions blood pressure increased or hypertension, so again the event would become unlisted. Similarly, if the term herpes zoster is given, but the patient with whom we are dealing in our clinical trial is having multidermal herpes zoster. So again, these are some classical examples given in the CTFG guidance document, the way it has to be interpreted. And of course, there is a medical decision every time based on the way the patient presents. And again, there are some other classical examples. If the RSI just says arrhythmia, but our patient is having ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia or atrial fibrillation, which is a specific form of arrhythmia. So obviously, we have to make the event this is more specific information. And in such kind of scenarios, the adverse event or the SARs would become unexpected, and they have to be reported to the regulatory authorities on an expedited basis if the requirement is to report SUSAR cases. Now, how should expected SARs be listed in the RSI? First of all, only MedDRA terms are allowed in the RSI section. So, and again, this is as per the CTFG guidance document. They give some examples how to interpret that. Now, if a product that is known to cause, say, profound immunosuppression, if we get to know that we just have a PT of infection, but in our case, say cytomegalovirus retinitis happened, which is an infection that will happen with the extreme degree of immunosuppression. So unless like our RSI section says fatal infections or different kind of infections, and then we can justify the expectedness. Otherwise, if just a term infection is mentioned, then that will become unexpected if we have a specific kind of infection, especially that is happening because of profound immunosuppression. Now, another thing that is mentioned in the CTFG guidance document is that a suspected SAR should be considered unexpected unless the PT is listed as an expected SAR in the RSI. For example, if urticaria is not included in the RSI, the occurrence of an individual case of urticarial rash SAR should be classified as a SUSAR. Another important point that I would like to highlight is the synonymous medical terms, whether they are allowed in the RSI or not. So there can be some synonymous medical terms, say somnolence or drowsiness. So they may represent the same medical phenomena. So they are allowed in the RSI, and they should not be confused with different forms of the same medical phenomena. Now there can be different forms of rash, such as say rash generalized or rash maculopapular or rash pustular, so which are not considered to be the same medical phenomena. In fact, like if you look into the medra, there will be a specific PT terms for that. So we have to then take the decision accordingly when we are getting these kind of terms. So, and just to give some examples again, which are given in the CTFG guidance document also, if there is a specific anatomic specification, say if a patient is having right upper lobe pneumonia, but then our PI or the RSI or the SMPC mentions that pneumonia is an expected event, so that extra anatomical specification will not make any difference. Those kind of events would be considered expected. Similarly, like if GI bleed is mentioned in the PI and our patient is having hematemesis or melena, so practically they are expected because it's not carrying any additional medical value. Now, this is something, as I mentioned earlier also, that there can be some safety information which may not be required to be included in the RSI of the IB. So, what all safety information? Because the moment we say serious expected ADRs, they become a part of the RSI. But if you're talking about the non-serious adverse events, or say the SAs which were considered unrelated to the IMP by both the investigator and the sponsor, so or maybe the fatal SARs which for which the decision was taken not to take them as expected. So those kind of events basically are a part of other sections of the RSI, which could be the summary of data and guidance, or maybe the data on safety under effect in humans. So they would typically not be considered in the RSI section of the IB unless the fatal event is considered to be expected, and there is a strong rationale to justify that. Now, the SARs that have occurred only once, unless there is a strong plausibility of causal relationship, should be made there. This was something we already discussed. And then the deaths or SAs also, which are considered efficacy endpoints in trials with high mortality or morbidity, accepted in the authorized protocol by the competent authority to be treated as disease-related events and not subject to systemic unblinding. So again, this is again a kind of a scenario where the safety information should not be captured in the RSI. And then another thing is if there are some SARs that are expected for similar products within the therapeutic class which did not occur in subjects taking the IMP. So this is a very important point. Sometimes we get confused that, okay, if the drug of the same class, say if we are dealing with a MAO inhibitor, which is a novel MAO inhibitor, and we know that a particular event is known to happen with some other monoamine oxidase inhibitor, but that doesn't mean that for the investigation product, what we are dealing with, if we are not having a particular serious adverse event which is related with that IMP, so that can never become a part of that RSI. So again, boiling down to the same point, that we need to have the data from the human population. First of all, it cannot be based on the anticipated pharmacological properties of drug, and of course it has to be the data has to be based on the actual SAEs which are reported from the exact IMP with whom which we are dealing, not with the drug of the same class. And of course those events have to be related to justify for the inclusion in the RSI section. Now, there can be scenarios where, of course, the reference safety information could be there in the IB, but there are no expected SAR. So the CTFG guidance document, and in fact, many of the European authorities, they want that the section of RSI should still be there. You can always call it out that, okay, there is no SAR, especially like when there is a product in the early clinical development phase, when the exposure is low. Obviously, if the exposure is low, and say if it is a phase 1 trial where the patient population or the human population has not even been exposed, so obviously at that point in time there will be no SAR. So if there is no SAR at a particular point in time, we can always mention in the RSA section that okay, there are no SARs applicable at this point in time. Even sometimes we have seen studies even up till phase 2 where we see that the IB RSA section still just mentioned that okay, at this point in time there are no serious expected adverse reaction. So any SAE which is basically happening in the trial practically becomes unexpected. So which is fine, because as per the authorities and as per the CTFG guidance document, only when you have those serious adverse events which are related, which are having a strong, for which you have a strong justification, they only should be a part of the RSA. So if there is no such SAE which is related, for which you have a strong justification for causality, at the end of the day, if you don't have such event, your RSA will remain blank. But you have to always call it out that as of now, there are no SARs, or there is no SAE which is related or which was considered to be expected. So for practical purposes, all the serious adverse events which will be reported in the clinical trial would be considered unexpected in a way. Now, another again important point, which is important, and many times we have to deal with that, which is how to deal with those kind of products which are a combination of IMPs. So again, the CTFG guidance document has a clear-cut guidance on this. It mentions that the sponsor may use the reference safety information, which is an IB or SMPC section 4.8, that includes expected SARs for the combination of investigational medicinal product based on an evaluation of the suspected SARs to a similar combination in the previous trials. Of course, and when I use the term SMPC, so that is basically for those products which are in the post-marketing phase. Otherwise, it's basically only for the IB if the product is purely in the clinical trial. Now, the CTFG guidance document also mentions that if the sponsor does not have data in an investigation portion or section 4.8 of an SMPC from the clinical trials, which have used the proposed IMP combination, multiple IBs or SMPs may be used as a reference safety information, that is one for each investigational medicinal product. So when deciding between the two options, the sponsor should consider the consequences of using multiple IBs or SMPCs on SUSA reporting when the causality assessment concerns the combination rather than the individual investigational medicinal product. That is, if a suspected SAR is not expected for any of the investigation medicine product or occurs with an increasing severity for any of the investigation medicine product, it will be required to be reported as a SUSAR, which is suspected unexpected serious adverse reaction. So I think this is all that I have for my initial section, and I would now request Dr. Arun to talk about the procedure for the update of the RSI during clinical trials. Over to Arun.
Thank you, Dr. Mignani. Now we're going to see the procedure for update of the RSI during clinical trials. So a substantial amendment is always required to be submitted if there are changes to the RSI. What's a substantial amendment? Not all amendments can be substantial. Changes, for example, changes to the format of the table that do not affect the expected SARs, or slight modification of exposure rates that do not result in a change in the frequency category without the addition of new expected SARs, or new preferred terms classification are not considered substantial. When submitting a substantial amendment that involves an IB or SMPC update, the cover letter must indicate if the RSI is being updated or not. And then upon submission of an IB in a substantial amendment application containing an update to the RSI, which is not accompanied by a product protocol amendment, the sponsor should specify in the submission cover letter what risk mitigation measures are already in place in the protocol to manage any new safety issues, and if these new safety issues are adequately covered in the subject information leaflet or informed consent form, or if it needs to be updated. The update of RSA can be of three different categories. One, if the RSI is within the IB prepared by the sponsor. Two, if the RSI is within the IB which is not prepared and updated by the sponsor. And the third category is if the RSI is in section 4.8 of the SMPC. Now let's take a look at the first category, update of the RSI in the IB prepared by the sponsor. The RSI is used for, number one, assessing expectedness of suspected SARs for expedited reporting of SUSARs, and number two, for the identification of SUSARs in the cumulative summary tabulation of serious adverse reactions in the DSUR. If the RSI is within the IB prepared by the sponsor, it's highly recommended to update the RSI section of the IB if necessary, only once per year after the data log point, along with the new DSUR. It is expected that cumulative safety data from across the preclinical and clinical development program is reviewed during the annual IB update, and that the IB update can take place while preparing the DSUR, mostly within the 60 days after the DSUR annual reporting period. Let's continue with the update of the RSI in the IB prepared by the sponsor. Next slide, please. So substantial amendments for all trials that use the IB should be submitted to the authorities in all EU member states where trials are ongoing in parallel to the DSUR submission. The DSUR may include the supportive data for justification of the RSI update. For example, reference may be made to the tables, line listings, or other data within the DSUR to support a proposal to add an expected SAR. The newly updated RSI can only be used for assessment of expectedness of suspected SARs for the purposes of expedited reporting after the approval of the substantial amendments in all of the member states where trials are ongoing. Therefore, if additional SUSARs occur before the new RSI is approved, these should be reported as SUSARs in the usual expedited manner. Next slide, please. So here is an example of an IB RSI update following DSUR reporting period. If you look closely, there are two divisions here. The DSUR reporting period in gray fonts at the top and the IB version with green bars at the bottom. So typically DSUR and IB are submitted at the same time. DSUR needs no approval, but IB needs approval. So typically IB approval takes about 2 months. So if you look at the boxes here, the substantial amendment and DSUR number 9 submitted in this case on 30th of September, and it is approved down the line. There is a delay of about a couple of months. That's when IB version 6 is approved. So we should consider this IB version 6 as RSI for expedited reporting only after its approval. If there is an adverse event that occurs before IB version 6 is approved, then we have to use the previous version, which is IB version number 5, must be used as an RSI for expedited reporting. Next slide. So in the second category, where update of RSI in the IB not prepared and not updated by the sponsor, how do we handle RSI update? If the RSI is within an IB which is not prepared and updated by the sponsor themselves, for example, in the case of non-commercial sponsors using a company's investigator brochure, the non-commercial sponsor should have a written agreement in place with the company in which the updated approved IB is sent to the sponsor immediately. If the company has submitted a substantial amendment to authorities in EU member states in relation to the updated IB for any trial for which it is the sponsor, the non-commercial sponsor should await the completion of the assessment of the substantial amendment and submit the approved IB. This must be done together with any necessary amendments to the protocol as a substantial amendment for their own clinical trial. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the third category, the update process of an RSI in section 4.8 of the SMPC, if the RSI is in this section 4.8 of SMPC and this section is updated during the trial, it is recommended to submit a substantial amendment requesting approval for the approval of the update to the RSI immediately following completion of the variation procedure. Following approval of the SMPC for use as RSI in all member states where the trial is ongoing, the updated SMPC should be used for the purposes of expedited reporting. Next slide. Next slide, please. No, we need to go back to the previous one.
Is this the one or?
1 second. Yeah, this is the one. Thank you. So, an urgent update to the safety data in the IB may be deemed necessary by the sponsor or regulatory authorities at any time during the conduct of a clinical trial. So this information can be added to other sections of the IB, preferably to the safety and efficacy section under effects in humans and/or summary of data and guidance for investigators section. However, the RSI section of the IB should only be updated following the DSUR period and ideally should be submitted in parallel with the DSUR. Next slide, please. All right. So how is the RSI section identified in IB? If the RSI is within the IB for an investigational medicinal product and there is not a clearly identified section to this effect, where all expected SARs are included in the form of a table, an RSI section should be included in the IB at the next routine update, and a substantial amendment should be submitted. Until the RSI section is clearly identified in an approved version of the IB, all suspected SARs should be reported as SUSARs. Well, in terms of versioning of RSI to determine expeditedness of suspected SARs, for follow-up reports. The RSI in place at the time of occurrence of the suspected STR should be used to assess expectedness for follow-up reports to ultravigilance. USARs should not be downgraded in ultravigilance on the basis that the RSI was updated after the occurrence of the event. Well, that completes my part of the presentation. Now we are open to any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjeev, and thank you, Dr. Ram, for such an interesting topic. I have a couple of questions from the speakers. So, if stroke is mentioned in the SMPC, would embolic stroke be considered expected?
Sure. So Shruti, I'll answer that. So you said that the question is if embolic stroke is mentioned, is reported. So yeah, I think again these are some classical examples which are given in the CTFG guidance document. So first of all, whenever we are assessing the expectedness for any SAE which is reported, we have to see how exactly the term mentioned. So if the term that is mentioned categorically is stroke, and if we are getting in our patient embolic stroke or say hemorrhagic stroke or say vasculitic stroke, so obviously this is more specific. So this is not just mentioned in the CTFG guidance document. So even the SIOMS 5 document also talks about these scenarios. So whenever there is a specificity of any particular adverse event that is reported, so that becomes unexpected. So for this particular scenario, like the embolic stroke would become unexpected if the term mentioned in the RSI is stroke.
Thank you. Second question, when is the amendment in the IB considered to be substantial?
Right. So the amendment is considered to be substantial, especially if we look from this particular perspective, like the RSA perspective. The many of these regulations, like say MHRA or the European authorities or even the FDA, so they are very particular that if there is any inclusion of a new event in the IB in the RSA section, so obviously that's a significant piece of information. So if we have any new event that is added in the RSI, that is a substantial amendment. There is a substantial amendment. If there is an increase in the frequency of an existing event, even that is a substantial amendment, because that is also considered to be a strong signal. So if we already have some event of hepatic enzymes or say hepatitis, but then we are having higher frequency or higher severity, say if we have now fulminant hepatitis which is becoming part of RSI, that is also a substantial amendment. Say if the frequency increases for the event hepatitis, so earlier say it was somewhere between 1 to 10%. So 1 to 10% is something which is common, but now in the next annual IB update, if you are having hepatitis, say more than 10%, which is an increase in the frequency, which becomes very common. So that means that there is a kind of a safety concern in the human population. So whenever there is any increase in the frequency or the severity of the pre-existing events in the RSI, or if there is an addition of the new event in the RSI, so in those scenarios, the IB amendment is considered to be substantial. Of course, there can be other scenarios also, like if there is a significant preclinical information that the sponsor gathers or get to know when they are conducting some preclinical studies along with the clinical studies. Say if you get to know that, okay, this drug has a potential to cause carcinogenicity as a long-term follow-up in preclinical population that they've studied. So that information is going to be significant. Even in that scenario, the amendment can be considered substantial. But if we look from this particular topic perspective that we're talking about RSI, so the new event or the frequency increase or the severity increase warrants a substantial amendment.
Okay. Next question. If there is one serious adverse event that is probably related in which D challenge is positive, would it be part of RSI?
Again, first of all, it has to be a decision that has to be based purely on the exact presentation of the case. First of all, and in fact, like I mentioned in some of my slides earlier also, and of course, CTFG guidance gives the basic outline. But let us take an example, like the way you asked. If there is one event which is say related, whether we would take that as in the RSA or not. First of all, we have to see the every case based on the merit, based on the presentation. CTFG guidance document clearly mentioned that there are exceptions to the rule. If you have a case wherein, say, you have a strong D challenge, you have a re-challenge positive, where you are absolutely sure that this is due to the drug, like the example of drug-induced liver injury that I mentioned, where you classically are able to rule out other confounding factors. So obviously, if you have a strong justification, we can always even have a single event or a single case in the RS single event, say drug-induced liver injury, for inclusion in the RSI. But of course, whenever we are making such decision, we have to put the justification even at the time of the IB update, even at the time of putting that substantial amendment. We have to put that in the cover letter also, that why exactly we have made this substantial amendment and why we are including this particular event. But otherwise, it's not like the moment there are more than one SAR, it automatically becomes a part of the RSI. Even for the events which are occurring more than once, CTFG guidance says that generally those SARs should be reported in the or should be included in the RSA which are occurring more than once. But that doesn't mean that the moment it is two, the count is two, it automatically becomes a part of the RSA. For those scenarios also, we should have a reasonable causality where we should be able to make a decision that yes, this seems to be a very strong causality, a case with a strong causality, where you have enough reason to eliminate the other confounding factors. So otherwise, like even if you have say 2 or 3 cases, so say if you have a case of myocarditis, maybe where you think that yes, the drug can have a role or a possible role in causing myocarditis, but then you still have some other factors which cannot be completely ruled out, because say you have some viral infections, Coxsackie virus, which can cause it, you cannot completely rule out. Then in those scenarios, yes, you can even wait even for 2, 3, 4, even more, and unless you think that yes, there is a strong reason for including the RSI, then yes, you can include them. But yes, a golden rule is that yes, if you have 2 reasonable cases for which you have a strong causality, like say if you are like if we go with the WHO classification, where say probable means that the D challenge is positive, and then you have enough reason for temporal association. So like say if you have 2 probable cases, typically we would do a inclusion in the RSI, because probable causality association definitely means that there is high chance that is due to drug and less likely to be due to the drug.
Okay. Next question. If there is a signal from non-serious adverse events, would RSI section be updated?
Yeah, so again, as I mentioned that the IB has different sections, but if we talk strictly about the section on the RSI table, so that RSI table is strictly about serious adverse reaction if you're talking about clinical trials for the investigation medicine product. So of course there are different other sections like data on guidance for the data of the guidance for the investigators, or section on safety in humans. So there are some other sections which are part of IB. So those kind of events can become a part of those sections, but then they will not decide the effectiveness. So they will not decide the SUSA reporting for practical purposes. So similarly, like if there is a even a fatal reaction, but it is not related. So obviously we have to write say some death narratives, or we have to write some description of the cases. All that will be captured in some of the other sections of safety, and they obviously have to be included because that's a safety information. But then RSA section strictly has to be section only for the list of serious expected adverse reactions, for which you have enough reason for the causality, and you take a decision to keep them as a part of the expected events in terms of seriousness.
Well, we have a question for the RSI table as well. So what are the recommendations for order of the serious adverse reactions in the RSI expectedness table? Can it be decreased frequency or alphabetical order per SOC or PT, or severity of observed serious adverse reactions, first the ones with fatal or life-threatening events? What is your opinion about it?
Well, it's a very interesting question, but now if I recollect the RSI table, in fact, the one that I presented, probably I can go back to one of the slides. And in fact, the slide is exactly taken from CTFG guidance document. I don't think there is any specific frequency order that they have mentioned, because if you look at the count also, this is an example which has been taken categorically from the CTFG guidance document. So you see a high count of myocarditis and the cardiovascular disorder, which is the SAE with the highest number, say, but then that's not in the top. If you look at the number, say GI disorder, you have diarrhea 25. So it doesn't mean that CTFG guidance document recommend that cardiovascular should come up, or maybe if you have some fatal life-threatening events, that should come first. Of course, there is no harm having a process where you can always capture that, but I don't think the CTFG guidance document has any kind of specific recommendation for putting the order. Specifically, like if you see the example that they've given here, the example of cardiovascular disorder, then SOC is coming after GI and hepatobiliary. And the specific thing, especially what we have seen, especially when we get the feedback sometime from some of the regulatory authorities from Europe, they mentioned that the tabulation format, having the columns for fatal SARs, having the column for life-threatening SAR, even if the count is 0, which is going to be the case in most of the cases, that is important. Having the number of subjects getting exposed to the SARs, having the percentage. So that is the most important part. In fact, they typically need this format where they mention that, okay, you have to have the number of subjects exposed in the overall clinical development program. So you cannot have the number of subjects exposed for a particular study. So unless you have a reason to frame different indications, which generally would not be the case, but yes, they have given a leverage to do that. Otherwise, like if you're forming one table, the most important part is you are putting the event SOC wise. The preferred term is used in the second column. They want the number of subjects exposed, which is capital N. The small n is the number of subjects having that particular adverse reaction that we are dealing with. And then of course they need the percentage, because then you can decide whether it is common, very common. They're not asking you to put the categorization, but then they are expecting to put the percentage. But yes, if I talk about the order or alphabetical thing, if we look into this table, they are not expecting this format. So but yes, if any company has any particular process to put in a particular order, of course that is absolutely acceptable, but it's not like a mandatory thing or any recommendation from CTFG.
Okay. Another question, can a life-threatening event be considered as expected a serious adverse reaction in the RSI if it occurs more than once?
I think again, probably we covered this question earlier also, that it all depends on the presentation. As a rule, fatal life-threatening events are not required to be considered as expected, and every time if there is a fatal fatal event, the regulatory authorities expect that it is reported as a SUSA. But yes, if a signal has already been made, and if based on the benefit risk profile of the drug, if a fatal event is already a part of the SMPC or IB, then it's an expected event, so that doesn't become a SUSAR. But yes, the count, whether it is 1 or 2, especially for fatal life-threatening event, the sponsor should make the decision of putting a fatal event in the RSA only when they have a very strong reason to believe that yes, that event is a part of that is an expected event.
And the last question for the day, considering the time, what about non-serious events in RSI? Should it be captured, or what is its significance?
Yeah, I think this question was there earlier also. I think in a different form, if there is a signal from non-serious event, so it's a similar question. So again, even if there is a signal or if there are new non-serious adverse event, there are other different sections, like section on safety in human, that's a section, or guidance for the investigator section. So any non-serious event obviously is important. Nobody is discarding. There is a tabulation for non-serious events or serious events, but then they would not become a part of the RSI. They would be a part of the other safety sections, which is also quite relevant. But when it comes to the decision on SUSA reporting, they would not be applicable for the clinical trials for the investigation medicinal product. So that's what. But of course, if you are dealing with the post-marketing phase scenario, and if you have any non-serious event, they do become a part of RSI, because that is a different section, 4.8, where you have everything. And then of course, depending on the case presentation, you can take the decision on expectedness. But if you're talking strictly about a clinical trial for an investigational medicine product, of course, your RSA section is purely going to contain list of serious expected adverse reactions.
Absolutely. I think it was a great session today. Great speakers, great audience. And thus concluding the webinar, we understand that RSI is part of IP, and RSI section should only contain expected serious adverse reactions to the IMP. I think we also learned that a broader description of safety profile of the IMP in addition to the RSI, that is non-serious adverse reactions, suspected serious adverse reactions that have occurred only once, and fatal and life-threatening serious adverse reactions that are considered expected and not included in the RSI should be included elsewhere in the IB. I thank you, speakers, for contributing to this knowledge share conference, and I thank all the audiences and all the attendees for your participation, your questions, and your time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks for attending.